Oh, yeah, I've seen that happen a lot. Yeah. One husband defended it because he said his wife was worshiping. She was at home offering burnt sacrifices. That's how bad her cooking was. It's time to start. John has both microphones. He's excited. We are in James chapter 2. The lessons were on the back table and were emailed out last night for those who didn't get it. Also, next week's lesson is printed out and is on the table to the left as you leave the auditorium, so make sure you pick that up. And we'll pick up, we're actually going to start in James 1:26 and kind of recap verses 26 and 27 before we move into chapter 2, because we cut that a little short in our time last week together. Let's start off with a prayer. And John, you got a mic, so I'm going to let you lead that. John Dean. Amen. All right, if we go back to James chapter 1 and we just kind of see this transition, there's this threefold presentation of what accepting the word looks like in verses 26 and 27. And all three of those things are pretty much woven throughout the book. That is, he's talked about from the very beginning that the goal is to mature, and then he talks about wanting them to be doers and not just hearers only. That then we have this threefold kind of application of what accepting the word looks like. When you accept the word of God, you control your tongue, you have concern for the helpless, and you avoid worldliness. And you can see how that's woven throughout the passages and the rest of the book. In verse 27, it talks about pure and undefiled religion. And we kind of hurriedly went through this on last week, but it would be a mistake to interpret verse 27 as just a summation of everything that true worship involves. That's not what James is seeking to do here. In fact, it was Calvin that said James does not define generally what religion is, but reminds us that religion without these things he mentions is nothing. And so by saying pure undefiled religion is this, he's not saying that that is all that it is, but he is saying that if you don't do these things, and by these things, not just the widows and the orphans, by the way, which was so often focused on, but all three of those things in the previous slide, concerning for the helpless, controlling your tongue, and avoiding worldliness. If you don't do those things, then you're not changed, and your religion in that sense is worthless. And so what that really is pointing to in this section is caring for the helpless is a concrete action that is seen in the hearer. And the same is opposite as well, that when you don't care for the helpless, that's a concrete kind of warning sign that you're not letting the word change you and who you are. What is interesting, especially I think among some of our brethren, is that we focus so much on this widows and orphans that we forget that also in that is this avoid worldliness, or to keep yourself unstained from the world, which again shows this kind of threefold point here as well. So that kind of wraps up the book, or not the book, but the section there, and kind of leads us into the first of those kind of sections where he's going to continue this idea of how we view other people, which brings us to the first section in chapter 2. I left my questions, I apologize for this, in my office on the desk, so we're just going to not so much go question 1, question 2, but hopefully the questions will help us along the way. What is going on in these first four verses of this section? And I know that was one of your questions. What is he doing here? Remember to raise your hand, and we'll get a mic to you. We want people outside and at home to be able to hear. What's going on in those first 4 verses? Scott?
Appears that the brethren are showing partiality, basically. You know, they're judging people based upon their state of wealth.
Okay.
You know, as to where they sit and all that kind of stuff, and how their clothing appears and all that. So that's what's happening.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. It is certainly a passage about the discrimination against the poor, which, by the way, serves as an application of what it means to be a doer back in verse 22 of chapter 1, and not a hearer only. And it is also an application of what was just said in verse 27 in this summation that was given there. And in the process of this, what he's doing in verses 1 through, especially 2 through 3, is he's really developing a hypothetical picture. This is not a specific instance, but it is a hypothetical scenario. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a real problem, because the reality is, it is obviously a real problem because he's dealing with it, and also because verse 6 says, this is what you've done. It becomes more real in that application. But here he's painting this hypothetical picture in the first couple of verses. And so, as we kind of dive a little deeper into this, what is the command of verse 1? I know that was also a question, so you should have that. Raise your hand. What's the command of this section? And not just verse 1, but really the command for this whole section, verses 1 through 13. And then the rest of it all builds off of this command. So what's the command there? Let Scott say that into a microphone there.
Don't be partial.
Yeah, don't be partial. Partial or favoritism is the idea there. Now, the problem is this passage, the way it's written in the Greek, is kind of a difficult translation, because the most closely literal of all the translations, just as a general rule, is the New American Standard. And if you're a fan of that, that's great. I'll be honest, one of the problems with the American Standard is it kind of reads difficult sometimes because it's so close to literal. So this is one of those cases. Do not hold your faith with an attitude of favoritism. And that just seems kind of a little bit more difficult. In contrast, the NIV kind of says this: believers must not show favoritism. And that's easier to understand, although it is less literal. And I think that's one of those things, by the way, we could have a long conversation about literalism and translations and how all that works. But this gives you kind of a peek into why things aren't always a literal word-for-word translation. In fact, it's just not possible for them to be literal word-for-word, and you believe that or understand that fully. This idea of favoritism is interesting because the Greek word here means to receive the face. Okay? And it's a compound word. It means to receive the face, and it is apparent that the word was invented by New Testament writers. It's not used in any other works that we know of in the Greek. And there are other close kind of ideas, but in this passage, in these 3 specifically, this word is used here. What do you think that means then, to receive the face? What does that mean when you think about that? Because it's kind of an odd kind of thing. What's that? Raise your hand and what does it mean, receiving the face? Nobody? No guesses? Guesses are welcome. It means to essentially judge based on appearance. And simply based on appearance. And here the direct, by the way, connection in James 2 is how people are dressed. How do we know that, by the way? How do we know it's about clothing? because it says it, right? It says that the rich man comes in and he's wearing a gold ring and fine clothing, which, by the way, that idea of fine clothing is kind of clothing that kind of is bright and shiny. And it's a stark contrast to the clothing that is described to the poor man of what?
Filthy.
Yeah, shabby for some translations, or filthy. And the reason why filthy is important is because that's the same word for filthy that was used back in chapter 1, describing the garments we're to take off. And so again, James is intentionally connecting these ideas, right? So you have in this scenario the rich man that comes in this really nice clothing, and what do they do for him? Okay? They put him up front, give him a seat of honor. Do you remember the whole discussion about Pharisees liking the best seat in the house? Jesus talked about that. So they bring this person in, and they set him up front where everybody can see. Here's this guy dressed really nice. And then where's the person with the shabby clothing? Where do they go in this section? John?
They don't even get a seat. They stand.
They either stand in the corner, essentially, you stand over there, or you sit at my feet. In fact, the language here says to sit beneath my footstool, which is not possible, but what's the idea of that? What's the idea presented here? One guy is set up front. What do we want when we set him up front? Everybody's got to see him. And then the other guy is to sit as low as possible or in the corner stand. What does that mean? What's that? Out of sight. Mark says, we don't want him to be seen. Does this ever happen? I mean, today, does this really happen? Yeah. And I'll be honest with you, if a church is really active in reaching out to the lost, that means that there's going to be people show up at times that, well, they're not dressed the way you think you should dress for church. How do you handle that? I had one time somebody came up to me. We had a couple of families that had come. We had one family we had converted, difficult background. Just praise be to God, they're there, right? Comes up and go, where did those people come from? What was that based on? It was based on how they looked. And that could be what they're wearing. It could be their skin color. It could be if they have tattoos. It could be the number of piercings they have. It could be whether they dye their hair a weird color or cut their hair into a mohawk. I mean, look, in our culture, there's a lot of ways that appearance is changed. Yes, John Dean, I'm talking about you, but it's not true mohawk. We all know it's fake. But the reality is, whenever we respond to those things, James is talking about us. That's the key. Scott?
So I'd like to say that has never happened here.
But you can't lie.
But I can't lie. Exactly. It's happened, and it happens, I know that when, there have been times in my life when I've seen things or whatever, and I think, ooh, or whatever. But then, there's a realization like, yeah, but those people are visiting, or, I don't know these people, I don't know their story. But just as you said, I mean, it has happened on more than one occasion. It's like, we had this person come in there dressed like la, and I'm like, well, do you know that person? Well, no. Well, they're visiting, so maybe we should cut some slack there.
Yeah, I think you guys know Barry Kirchhoff. I think Barry Kirchhoff's preached here before. One of Barry's sons one time was in this phase of life where he had a long beard and he walked into where I was preaching at the time. He arrived late, and he was been traveling. He had on a pair of jeans and kind of dirty looking, and shirt was kind of raveled, and an old trucker hat, and a big old long beard, and all of a sudden he goes to the bathroom first thing comes in because he's been traveling, And all of a sudden, the couple of deacons are getting up worried about who walked in the building and what they're up to. Well, what's make that funny is that this guy's grandparents went to church there. His grandfather was a former elder. I mean, and he's a great kid. But because he wasn't dressed normal, we were all concerned if he was going to do something to us. And there are a lot of stories like that. And so that's what's happening here as we're judging. By the way, we're not going to read these, but there's a strong connection to the Hebrew Bible about not judging people this way and not showing partiality and taking care of those who seem to be poor. One last thing is, by the way, this is only the second and the last time that James refers to Jesus as Christ in this letter. And he also uses the word glory here, which is a play on words, I think, to remind them of, and this is in verse 1, of the glory of God as compared to the glory they're giving to the rich people in verses 2 and 3. That it's the Lord that deserves the glory and not these rich people in verses 2 and 3. Now, just to recap what's going on then in verses 2 through 4, there's this scenario. It's a congregational meeting, I think, in the context. By the way, what's really interesting about that, I'm just going to say this real quick, move on. The word here is synagogue. And this is the only time in Scripture it appears that it's not being used about a Jewish synagogue. It's being used about a meeting establishment that is used by Christians, which just implies that this meeting was set up and facilitated by this group of people. This is not the Jewish synagogue, but it's their meeting. It's their synagogue. You come in, and the rich are given this preferential treatment in a place of honor, and the poor are told to sit as low as possible to avoid being seen. And all of this is determined by what you wear. All of that is determined by what you wear here in the context. And so, in verse 4, what does he say they are doing there? He makes an accusation by using kind of a rhetorical device. What does he say in verse 4? You've become a judge. You are judging one another there. Have you not then made distinctions among yourselves? And what he's saying there is, you're guilty when you do this. Through this rhetorical question, he's implying their guilt. By the way, among yourselves is interesting because it could mean in yourselves. And it's used more about an internal form of doubt in places like Matthew 21 and Mark 11 and Acts 10 and Romans 4. And why that is interesting is because it seems like that could be a better usage of this word simply for this reason. We'll go back to my friend Moo again. The improper division being made between rich and poor reflects improper divisions harbored in the minds of the believers. Which goes back to that singular focus and intent of chapter 1 we talked about, your internal character that James is dealing with. And consistently, Christian conduct comes from a consistently Christian heart and mind. And so this among yourselves probably should be seen as among or in yourselves, more like in yourself personally, rather than among yourselves as a group. Meaning, how can you as an individual allow this preferential treatment to go on? And I think that's got a powerful application there that needs to be made. And when they do this, they are putting themselves in the place of God to judge other people. Isn't that what he says? You're judging others, but with the wrong standards. You're judging them with evil thoughts rather than righteousness. Rather than judging, in the words of Jesus, judging with righteous judgment, you're judging by the wrong standard there. Any questions or comments about that section, verses 1 through 4? Anything to add to that? Charlie, let's get a mic over here, John, if you will. And if anybody has anything else, go ahead and raise your hand. John Dean will get you a mic.
I hate these things. Just a funny little story. We had meetings, or the city had meetings every week, Civitans, whatever. And Ted Turner was coming to the event. And I had to go down to cover the event. And I walked in there, and everybody in the city of Birmingham who was anything was in that room with their finest. Ted Turner walks in with a pair of blue jeans and muddy boots. And I always thought that was symbolic, that Turner always wanted to be a regular guy. And that's what he walked in this meeting with muddy boots.
Yeah. Reminds me of the stories you hear about Sam Walton driving his old beat-up truck and overalls to Walmart. The difference was he owned Walmart. And so sometimes the clothes are misleading, for sure. All right, so starting in chapter 2 in verse 5, he's going to present 3 arguments against this, why this scenario is wrong. And so I'm going to introduce those 3 ideas to you, and then we're going to dive in deeper. Number 1, in verse 5, it contradicts God's attitude towards mankind. Number 2, in verses 6 through 7, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, I could put that a lot differently, but that just seems to be the easiest way to say that. And then the remainder of this section, it violates the royal law of love in verses 8 through 13. So as we dive into this first one, it contradicts God's attitude towards men. Look at verse 5 there. Has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him? What is God's attitude towards those in poverty? Raise your hand. Scott, over there.
God looks favorably among at the poor. I'm sorry, and doesn't want them to be mistreated. He doesn't want any of that, but he looks favorably at it. And one of the reasons is because they're poor of this world. They don't have the things to look at in this world that the rich do. Okay. And so that draw may not be as strong for them.
Okay. Anybody else? Megan is half raising her hand, so I'm going to call on her. It's like at an auction, if you do anything, you're up next. You got the bid.
It says rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom.
Okay.
That's how he looks at the poor.
All right. And why are they rich in faith? Part of it's their response, but what else? Curtis back here in the back.
The way I look at it is this, in the Lord's Prayer, he says, give us this day our daily bread. Well, it's the poor people who know that they are getting their daily bread from God. So they have that relationship with God, and that's why he looks favorably on them, because they're seeking him.
Okay. All great comments. All great comments. I think one of the things to understand is God makes the poor rich in faith. He's the one that offers them that, and that he's the source of that. And regardless of their possessions, Christians possess spiritual wealth and receive greater blessings in the future. And I think that's a key here. A key point to all of this is that regardless of what you have, I think one of the things to make sure you understand is, regardless of what you have, God offers you the same thing. And it has nothing to do with your possessions. God has chosen the poor to inherit the kingdom, but he's actually chosen everyone to inherit the kingdom. I mean, it's Paul that says, I think it's 1 Timothy 2, he desires for all men to be saved, not just the poor. And here's a warning that we've got to be very careful about. We don't replace one discrimination in this text with another discrimination. Let me tell you why that's so important to us. Because whether you realize it or not, there's not a poor person in this room right now. Now, you may be poorer than someone else in this room, but by the world's standards, nobody here is poor. We don't understand poverty in our country. And that's not meant to be judgment on us. It's meant to be factual. If you own a car, if you have a roof over your head that does not have a dirt floor, if you're able to eat 3 meals a day or even 2, you are not poor. And so if we take this to mean that only the poor receive this blessing from God, we might as well go home. Do we all understand that? That's not what James is saying here. What he is trying to get them to see is that God loves the poor and makes them rich in faith. You should love the poor too. That's the point here. And by the way, there is no doubt that based on verses 2 and 3, poor here has a tie to materialistic things. But there is a broader meaning here that this word for poor does mean the idea of being poor in spirit. The humility, which by the way, can be had while having worldly possessions. The example of Turner showing up in muddy boots and jeans is kind of just a everyday example of that. He felt no need to put on some kind of pretense in front of people in that sense. And so the idea here needs that we need to be very careful that we don't go so far with this that we go too far. Okay?
You know, Terry,
Yes.
anybody that works for any big corporation has probably had to go through a lot of inclusion and diversity training,
Sure.
right? But God has called on us to be the most diverse and inclusive people on the planet. Because God's called on us to be like Him, to ignore what's on the outside and look at the inside, at the heart.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The problem is we want to put the word only in verse 5. That God only chooses the poor for this. And that's not what is going on here. Now, in verse 6 and 7, he really presents this idea that, hey, this just doesn't make sense because there's an implied accusation that what these people are doing is they are showing preference to the rich in order to get an exchange of favor at another time. The people here, remember, we're talking about people who've lost their possessions, who've been persecuted, and who have, even in this text, he talks about that these are the people who have persecuted you. They have gone and taken you to court and stolen your land from you. They've taken your possessions. They've mistreated you. And now what you want to do is show them some kind of honor within the assembly in hopes that they'll give you honor in return. And that doesn't make any sense because they've already proven that's not the case. Now, one thing we didn't talk about earlier is who these people are in verses 2 and 3. Are they visitors? Are they... I would tell you that I probably lean towards these being new converts in verses 2 and 3. More than visitors, but maybe not the established members in that kind of sense. I'd put them in that weird kind of transitionary category. Because they're new, but they are disciples, it seems, in the sense that they're brethren, but they're receiving this kind of treatment. And so what he's saying here really is this idea of, from a social economic standpoint, you're making this preference in order to receive in return, but you've already been proven that doesn't happen. And then verse 7 goes, not to mention they also have blasphemed the Lord. Now, in that, he's not talking about the actual people that are meeting with them, but the rich in general, showing preference because people are rich in general. And these are the overgeneralized characteristics of the rich of the day. They're going to take your land from you because what happened in the first century is the wealthy got wealthier. And if you were the middle-class person that still was agrarian, still owned your land, it was very common for them to find a way to come in, take your land from you, move you off of their land, them gather up the land. It was very much of a social class kind of economic system, and the nobility became more wealthy by gaining and taking all your stuff. And so this idea that you could show preference to the rich, common sense says no, and here's this one, the most noble one that you follow, they blaspheme. And so when you see that, what James is saying, this doesn't make any sense to do this. If anything, you should be showing preference to the poor because that's who you are. And you should understand that. Now, all of that is really setting up to this point, and I think what we've got about 15 minutes to cover, which is this last section about the royal law of love. And I really think that James has been trying to get to this point where it simply says, these two things. If you keep this law, you're doing well, but if you show favoritism, you sin. That is a very generic summation of verses 8 through 13. If you keep the royal law, and what is the royal law of love, by the way? Raise your hand. Well, who's got that? Okay, Curtis?
Love your neighbor as you love yourself.
Yeah, love your neighbor as you love yourself. We also call that the golden rule, right? And so that idea is what's presented here. Royal law is also, it would connect you back to verse 25 of chapter 1, the perfect law of liberty. There is this kind of idea there. And we talked a little bit, I think, last week about this idea of law. And I think just to expound upon that a little bit more, that when we see that here, we think of normally law of Moses, but James seems to be talking about something more than the law of Moses. He seems to be talking about this idea that the law of Moses as reinterpreted and imposed upon us through Christ. And that's the perfect law of liberty. That's the royal law in this sense as well. I think it's interesting, we'll get to that in a minute. I think it's interesting, by the way, that this kind of touches on one of our issues sometimes is we want to set the law of Moses and the gospel at odds with each other. We want to make one like the law of Moses. We want to talk about how it's all about works and that the gospel of Jesus is all about grace. And yet, the reality is there's a lot of grace in the law of Moses. You know how you see the law of Moses showing grace? You didn't have to die every time you sinned, because that's what in Genesis 2 and 3 we're told is the penalty for sin. There was grace that an innocent animal could cover your sins and you not die. That was a form of grace. And oh, by the way, we're going to get into next week that even when we want to talk about the law of Moses is all about works, what's James going to say? Don't tell me you have faith if you don't have works. So we often want to put these laws at odds, that one shows grace and one shows works, and the gospel gives liberty, and the law of Moses didn't give any liberty, and the law of Moses had a heavy expectation while this one has a lighter expectation. And none of that is really true. They're not at odds with each other. In fact, what you see is that the perfect law of liberty, this idea of the gospel, is really rooted in the law of Moses and its understanding. I mean, you just think about what we talked about, those three things at the end of chapter 1, controlling your tongue. Did the law of Moses talk about how to control your tongue? Did it talk about not blaspheming? Did it tell kids not to curse their parents or they'd be put to death? Yeah. Did the law of Moses talk about how you were supposed to care for those who were less fortunate than you? Yes. Did the law of Moses talk about avoiding worldliness? Yes. And so this perfect law of liberty and this royal law kind of idea is, again, that it is the law, but as imposed by Christ through his gospel. And so I think that's interesting as well. Now, what is interesting when it comes to the neighbor is this royal law is love your neighbor as yourself. The Jews, how did the Jews interpret that statement? Who was their neighbor? You remember? You remember the story in Luke 10? Who is my neighbor? What was he trying to get at? He was trying to restrict that circle as small as possible so he didn't have to do anything for anybody. What story did Jesus tell? The Good Samaritan. What was the point of the Good Samaritan? Gina says everybody's your neighbor. Everybody's your neighbor. The Jews only viewed the Jews as their neighbors. But Jesus said, no, all the nations are your neighbors. Okay? So then we get to verse 9, but if you show partiality, connection back to verse 1, see how he does that? If you show partiality, you are committing sin or convicted by the law as transgressors. James just doesn't mess around at this point and says, when you do what we talked about in those first 4 verses, you are breaking the law. Which law? All of them. Did they break the law of Moses doing this? Yes. Did they break the perfect law of liberty, the gospel? Yes. They broke the law of God, as Scott Vincent said. This idea there is summed up here by Moose. Since favoritism violates the command of love, the heart of the kingdom law, the final conclusions James draws in this verse follows a matter of strict logic. Believers who show favoritism are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. You're a lawbreaker. Now, would that language of being a lawbreaker carry a heavier kind of sentiment to this group of Jews? Absolutely. 100%. And he expands upon this in verse 10 by saying, if you break just one command of the law, what happens? You're guilty of all of it, right? And this idea of the unity of the law is not a new idea. Jews and pagans understood that. There was a quote I found by Seneca, the Roman moralist, who said, "He who has one vice has all." So even non-Jews, non-Christians, people who didn't follow Jehovah, they understood this idea. The breaking of one law is a violation of all of the law. In Galatians 5 and verse 3, this same principle is used by Paul there in regards to circumcision. But basically says, if you bind circumcision, that you got to keep the entire law of Moses. You're obligated for all of it. Now, I think it's important here to understand that this is a proverbial truth being presented. James knows nobody can keep the whole law. He's not saying that's possible. But it's a proverbial truth he's trying to tell them, to say, if you do this, then you violated the thing you're claiming to keep. Another Moo quote, if we view the law as a series of individual commandments, and I love the way he says that, we can assume that the disobedience of a particular commandment incurred guilt for that commandment only. But in fact, the individual commandments are part and parcel of one indivisible whole because they reflect the will of the one lawgiver. To violate a commandment is to disobey God himself and render a person guilty before him. Why is it that if you break one part of the law, you break all of the law? Because you have disobeyed the lawgiver. In this case, God. Which then takes us to verse 12, where this is said. Based on what he said, he goes, then so speak and act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. What does that mean, to speak and act as those who are judged under the law of liberty? I know that was one of your questions, by the way. Remember that one. What does that mean? Raise your hand. Scott Vincent there has got his hand up.
I don't know if it's right, but I said we should be intentionally genuine in practicing the Word of God. So we're looking to keep the whole thing. We're looking to speak and act in the way that God wants us to. So we have to be genuine in what we're doing and realize that it's the whole that we're trying to keep.
And I love that idea because that ties into so much what we said in chapter 1 and even earlier about in yourselves. This idea of being intentionally, internally genuine and real. That you're not double-minded, okay, to use that language and idea. I like that. Anybody else? John Dean?
I've been thinking about what this book is all about, and it's this battle between God and evil for the one thing that they want in this world, the souls of men and women. And that's what they're after, the souls.
Right.
And if we can remember that, and if we can think that, and if we can live that every day, in each person that we see, we have that perspective of this is a soul made in the image of God. If we've got that mindset going into anything, the way we look at someone, the way we talk to someone, the way we act, then I think there's an enormous amount of freedom and liberty in the law that God allows us to exercise, bring people to Him.
Okay.
And so that's kind of what I thought of in verse 12, is if you've got that perspective of this world is filled with the souls, and that's what the higher powers want.
Okay.
Everything else is noise. Everything else that we see in this world just gets in our way.
All right. I think there needs to be this understanding that there should be a direct connection back to chapter 1 and verses 22 through 25. Because that's where the law of liberty idea is introduced by James, right? Did you think when you read this that, oh, he said that before? And what was that section about? Being doers and not just hearers, right? And what's he saying here in verse 12? Don't do what we talked about in verses 2 through 4 because it violates the royal law to love your neighbor as yourself. And when you do that, you break the whole law, so you go out and you be doers of the law. You speak and act according to this law. You reflect the love of God for everybody in how you respond to everybody. And he ties this to an eschatological connection, which just means judgment, by the way, and says, you're going to be judged on this. Which, by the way, is a transition to the next section. It says, yes, you're not judged just by your faith, but you're judged by your works that show your faith. And so he's already setting a stage here in these last couple of verses to head to there, but saying there is judgment coming for all of this. God's gracious acceptance of us does not end our obligation to obey Him. It sets it in a new footing. No longer is God's law a threatening, confining burden, for the will of God now confronts us as a law of liberty, an obligation we discharge in the joyful knowledge that God has both liberated us from the penalty of sin and given us in His Spirit the power to obey His will. To use as James's own description, this law is the implanted word written on the heart that has the power to save us. Go do the law and act like people that God has implanted the word on their heart. There's a responsibility here to live according to what God has done for you. Verse 13, in the last couple of minutes, there is a retribution formula kind of here, that this idea that people get what they deserve. And what he says there, if you judge other people without mercy, then you're not going to get mercy. By the way, we've seen that in a lot of other places, right? Forgive and be forgiven. Show mercy and receive mercy from God. And this idea of retribution is just people get what they deserve. And it's interesting, the Sermon on the Mount influence, James transforms the beatitude in Matthew 5 and verse 7. I'll turn over there and read that. Now you look at how similar these are. Matthew 5 and verse 7. He says there, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. He turns this into a curse now and says essentially, if you don't show mercy, you won't get any, you're cursed. It's interesting the connection to see there. And Zechariah, it was interesting in verses 9 and 10 of Zechariah 7, the Lord of hosts says, render true judgment, show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widows, the fatherless, the sojourner, the poor. Let none of you devise evil against another in your heart. How similar that is to this whole section. And he's reminding these Jewish people, hey, you've got to show mercy. And he ends this section with this statement, and we'll come back to this a little bit next week. Let me say this about this. This is not God's mercy that he's talking about in this statement. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And here's why. God doesn't struggle to balance mercy and judgment like we do. We think they're at odds with each other, but they're not. We just struggle to have them live in the same house. But God handles that perfectly. He perfectly balances his mercy and justice, and we don't. And so what is the recommendation then? As he said, hey, look, if you're not merciful, you won't get mercy. What he's saying there is in our mercy is you'd better be merciful, and if you have to choose between the two, choose mercy. If you got to choose somebody who owes you money and to take them to court or forgive them, forgive them. Why? Because the mercy you may get on Judgment Day by showing mercy then is way more valuable than whatever they owe you. That's the application of this text. And you put it back into the context of all 13 verses, when somebody comes in who just doesn't measure up to your standard and how they look and how they dress, show them mercy and set them up front. Don't judge them and sit them in the floor. And on the Judgment Day, rather than counting on the rich guy you want to sit up front to give you a favor, God will show you favor on Judgment Day. Mercy triumphs over judgment. We'll move on next week. Thanks for your participation and comments this morning.